Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to our next episode of Victims of Crime, where a bunch of morticians are going to discuss caring for a victim of crime and give some hypothetical of what we possibly would do in this type of scenario and dealing with the family, dealing with the deceased. We have Ryan and Brian from Undertaking the Podcast, who are funeral directors and embalmers in Indiana. And we're joined today by John Hill, who is a funeral director and embalmer down in North Carolina. In this case, John is actually from where this case took place. So you have a lot of insight into this, which will be an interesting perspective. Ryan and Brian do not know the case. So I am going to kind of surprise them with it now. So we're going to be talking about Kathleen Peterson. She was 48 years old when she died. The Staircase biography series on Netflix has just come out recently, and that covers her death. So if you want to really dive in, go to that multi-part series on Netflix. So she was a very accomplished woman, had been the first woman accepted into the engineering program at Duke in 1971. She had been married for a few years to novelist Michael Peterson. He had two sons, she had a daughter, and then together they had adopted two girls. So the day she died was December 9th, 2001 was when she was found. Her and Michael had been, according to him, watching a movie. They drank 2 bottles of wine. They'd gone out by the pool, and she had gone in for the evening to go to bed. He found her, and at 2:40 a.m., he called 911. She was found at the base of a staircase in their home, and there was literally blood everywhere. They found there was massive wounds to her head, the back of her skull. She had other abrasions and things on her body, a lot of abrasions on her face. The staircase was covered in blood, but only up about 5 feet on the stairs. Above that, there was nothing in the staircase, which was why they were like, Michael, did you have part in this? And so he became the prime suspect right away. Of course, the spouse always does. So it was found that she had bled to death. So we often see when there's a lot of blood, medical examiner investigators will be like, oh, they're not viewable right off the bat. So I've sent you guys pictures. You're welcome to pull them up, look at them. There's not a ton of pictures in this situation, but definitely crime scene pictures. You can see her face and you can see kind of what's going on with it. So tell me what you guys are looking at.
I had to download all of them at once.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, I'll break it down. First pictures of the house, kind of an aerial footage. And then the second one is, looks like crime scene photos, probably photos from the corner. She is lying with her back to the stairs. So it looks like her shoulders and head are resting on, it looks like stair 1 or 2. You're right, there is blood everywhere, which is very common for a head wound. The second one shows some splatter pattern on the wall. Also looks like a mark of where someone's brushed up against it, and a picture of the casket. Then there's some other pictures of her here as well. More of the blood splatter. Yeah, so lots of blood. Kari, you mentioned this show on Netflix, and I'm one of those people. You can mention any show, and I probably haven't seen it, but I did watch this. The stars lined up. I did watch this.
Did you?
Strangely, yes, I have seen the entire series. So yeah, I'm not talking out of the complete dark today.
Nice.
That's weird.
No.
Yeah, go ahead,
John,
guys.
being in that area, were these pictures, and was all of this like public? And did you, like, when you were hearing about this on the news and stuff, was this stuff like very front and center, or was this all kind of came later as the trial was going on?
I think all this came later when the trial started happening. I was in college actually at the time in Tennessee when all this took place, but my mother, she was watching Inside Edition every single night, keeping up with this case. And I was watching it as well, trying to see what's going on. And the house that it was in, I remember driving through there when I was a young kid. When I worked in Durham, we used to drive through that house all the time in that area. So it's just interesting with all of that going on at the time. It was just a big stir and everybody was talking about it. And of course, everybody said Michael Peterson did kill his wife and things of that nature. So it was a very, very big deal in the RDU area, and especially at catching wind all throughout the country. She was taken to the medical examiner's office there in Chapel Hill at the time. The medical examiner's office has now been changed to another area in Raleigh, but it's actually at the time was at the UNC campus, University of North Carolina, right on the top floor. And that's where she was taken to for her examinations. And she went to Howerton and Bryant Funeral Home there in Durham. And that's who took care of her body. I actually talked to the funeral director not too long ago, and he was on the case. And as a matter of fact, I think somebody like a trade embalmer actually was the one who took care of her with all these things that took place. So it was all these pictures that you see here and things started being more publicized as the case went on.
And
Let me chime in here.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Because I went through the pictures a little slower than Brian. There is blood everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the splatter is it's odd. It's an odd splatter.
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed that. It's not, and I've seen blood splatter, man. I mean, the homicides and things like that. It's not just splatter. It's almost like it's spread out onto the wall, onto the baseboard. Guys, I mean, the pictures, we don't show, but man, this is significant. You were right, John. Before we started talking about this, you were like, yeah, this is kind of a little bit more intense. Wow. Yeah, that's wow.
Well, in the blood, a lot of the trial was tracing that blood and why each area, and what they found was a lot of that was actually sprayed, that it had come to her mouth, and as she was coughing, it's being sprayed out by her breathing and coughing and gasping for air, essentially, because she was kind of drowning almost, and as it's going into her and stuff. I mean, so let me read the autopsy report a little bit. Now, reading over this is why I always tell families, take the autopsy report when you get it and go to a doctor and have them translate it for you, because something that looks like it's life altering might just be a common word that means like an everyday term that you really need somebody medical to translate an autopsy report. But so 48 years old at the time of death, autopsy done on December 9th, 2001, multiple lacerations and avulsions, which is tearing away of a body part, often forcefully. So that skin and things being pulled away, contusions on posterior scalp. So the main trauma to her was these 7 large lacerations to the back of her head. There was some subarachnoid hemorrhaging, which is bleeding of an artery on the brain, or in the brain on the surface, slight to moderate bilateral, parasagittal, cerebral convexities, which is just the top of the head. I mean, there's all these huge words that sound crazy and, it must be big, but they don't mean as much. They found that some cells in the brain were dying, but there was no contusions of the brain itself.
Yeah.
As you would probably think, okay, if Michael came in and bashed her over the head, how do you hit someone that you're just slicing the scalp, but not damaging the brain? So that was one of the big arguments. There was no skull fractures, no abnormalities to the brain, no cervical spine fractures, which you would sometimes see falling downstairs. There was a lot of contusions on her back, her arms, her wrists, her hands. She had 14 noted abrasions and contusions on her face. So a lot of nicks, cuts, things on her face. Cause of death ruled blunt force trauma to the head, even though some reports say she bled to death. So there's these two I think from the blunt force trauma, she had bled to death. I don't know. But she had laid dying for about 2 hours, which her blood alcohol level was only 0.07%. And she had diazepam in her system,
It's not 2 bottles of wine then.
Right. But if she'd laid dying for 2 hours, she might have, it might have been less than, I don't know. That was the first thing that I thought of too, was 2 bottles of wine. I guess it's only 1 bottle per person. Yeah. I don't know. So Ryan, I'm going to call on you as if we're in class. I feel weird when I say that, but so we're talking about all of this stuff and all this blood. I mean, you get this person, you open this bag and you see just blood. What is first reaction to that?
I need to bathe her.
Yes.
That's my biggest thing, man. I get so tired of coroners. I get so tired of people, pathologists, whoever it is that it has of some sort of medical authority telling me that, it's going to be a closed casket, or telling the family on scene that there may not be anything they can. Stay in your lane, man. Just stay in your lane and let me do my job. I'll say this, Brian and I have attested this together when we've done cases together. A simple bath will change the entire appearance of someone in many cases. So yeah, first thing I do, let's bathe, and then we can actually see what we're dealing with. Just blood everywhere doesn't mean anything to me anymore. It used to, as a medic, that was pretty, that was a tall tale sign that something's going on. Now, it's different. We want to clean them up and see what we're dealing with.
Yeah. Well, and John, we see when people are autopsied, and I think I actually saw you make this comment the other day on a conversation that I saw was transpiring, where the autopsy creates damage to the deceased also, like was it you talking about facial, like some people that were removing some, if there's trauma to the face, sometimes even during the autopsy, I'm not saying this happened in this case, they will remove part of the face to look under the tissue. Talk about some of the damage from autopsy. Damage is the wrong word. Some of the
byproducts,
added complications from autopsy.
Invasive procedure. Absolutely.
Yes. What are things you've seen?
Yeah. Basically, when the autopsy takes place and they take off the cranial cap, and you put the cranial cap back on, it doesn't matter how well you try to flush it and things like that. It's going to create sometimes that odd shape. And not only that, but also you have the eyes and the sockets. You also have the jaw and things like that could be a little bit more distorted, the cheek areas. So there's just a lot that could be happening with an autopsy case. And no doubt she was an autopsy. With the lacerations on her head, they had to go in there and they had to research everything. And so with all of that taking place, it does distort things. And a lot of times medical examiners aren't as careful in thinking about the family and the funeral home that'll be taking care of the body, taking care of this person, this loved one to a family after it's done. But they need, there needs to be a good balance there to where they do their job, but do it also more effectively as well. So it's not just trauma internally as far as them removing organs and them researching out the muscles and the sinews and the tissues underneath there. And some of you've heard of the nightmares of, arteries being cut to where you cannot inject and things like that. That goes without saying. But as far as the facial features go, there could be a lot of distorting involved, especially even with the cranial cap here. Sometimes the ears could get damaged because they do it wrongly. There's just a lot of things that could happen there. And even right here, some unwanted wrinkles that was not there on the forehead. Sometimes when you have to, take the skin and pull it forward to put the cranial cap back on. If you do that too long and you pull it back, you've got these creases that you don't want. So it's more than just them just opening everything up. It can cause a lot more trauma to the face with an autopsy being done. Absolutely.
Well, and if there's bruising, if
Mhm.
somebody's been hit by a car, like I've had multiple people, they're walking down the road and they get hit by a car, as a pedestrian, they will open the back of the legs and the front of the legs to get to the underlying bruising and tissue, or open the spine, down the spine rather than just the front. They'll go down the spine and open the back because they're trying
Wow.
to investigate situation where a woman had Botox couple days prior, but they didn't know if maybe that was caused, so they scooped out and kept tissue from the face. Like, okay, they've got to investigate, but it does cause some definite challenges on our side presenting for the family. So wondering if some of that investigative work in this scenario, especially since it's murder, possible murder and not just accidental. Brian,
well, you can see her face too, that it's not, her in the casket.
I don't know if
they could have done the same thing, and the muscles, with a lot of your facial features is not just because you got skin on it and the skull, but you got the muscles behind there and you've got the tissues. And when you go underneath all of that, it can definitely distort the appearance for sure.
So that one picture of the woman in the casket, I don't know 100% that's her. But Michael did say in an interview that she was buried, I feel like in a wedding dress or something, he commented. But so guys, the other part of this story is that during the investigation came up that a woman Michael had known years before, a neighbor from across the street, had also died and been found at the base of a staircase after she had had an interaction with him. And if you put the two women's pictures next to each other, they are like spot on to be sisters. And so I almost question if that woman in the casket was Elizabeth Radcliffe, which is the other woman. So during the course of the whole thing, they did a exhumation and they disinterred Elizabeth, and they went in, they actually shaved her head and investigated the wounds on her head to see if they were parallel to the wounds on the current situation, the current head. And so they went into all this stuff. And it's funny because in the documentary, I'm like a lack for words tonight. The documentary, Michael is heard saying, well, she's going to be exhumed. She's supposed to look like she was when she was buried. The whole idea behind embalming and sealed caskets and vault and stuff is to preserve how they looked.
No.
So Brian, do you want to tell us about like what is the timeline as to how long someone is preserved with embalming?
Oh, hopefully until the services are over. I mean, it's not forever, folks. It's never meant to be. I mean, if it was a thing back in the 40s and 50s for funeral directors to sell that, shame on them, because that's stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be practical. I mean, who anyway, I don't know. You don't get me started on this. It's just, first up, no, embalming is temporary. It's temporary preservation and sanitation, restoring to natural form and color. That's what we do for a temporary time. As funeral directors, it just gives us time. I explained this today to a family. Why would we do that? And I always use myself as an example. And if I drop dead right now, can my family come see me? Yep. Can they come tomorrow? Yeah, probably. What about day 4 or 5? Well, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, nature does what it does. And if we don't slow it down, and it's not stopping it, it's slowing it down, because we're all going dust to dust. It's just how quick. Then me as a funeral director can't look a family in the eye and say, yeah, a week from Tuesday is fine. Tell your family it's fine. You just can't do it. And there's no other substitute. There's no other substitute that has a lower impact on the environment than embalming, period.
He's right on. There's no question about it. I agree with Brian Waters on this. What I will say, when it comes to, I remember a case, Kari, maybe all of you remember this, the Big Bopper.
Oh yeah.
He was exhumed. Do you remember? I think it was his son that had him exhumed.
Mhm.
I don't know the entire story, so I can't speak intelligently on it. And Brian, just shut up. You don't need to add anything to that.
Okay.
But what I will say is when they exhumed him, if I recall, he very much was very still preserved, just
Mhm.
had a little bit of mold, on his nose or on a few different, cheekbones or things like that, where it gets dehydrated a little bit. But embalming can do a lot of things. I will say that it can deter decomposition, but it's not forever. I want people to understand that it is not forever. I think, the idea of if that was what we did back in the, 40s and 50s and told people that this is what this is what it does, then we were wrong, because we were misleading. That's not what it does.
John, can you tell us, how this story played out in terms of with the funeral director? You had said they had a closed casket for the public. We can look at her face and say, oh, it doesn't look like there's a lot of damage. There's quite a bit of work that would take with wax and cosmetics and things, with all of those little abrasions and nicks and cuts. But tell us what you know about, or can share with us about how that played out.
Yeah, there was nothing too detrimental to her as far as on the actual face goes. It was mostly towards the back of the head. And from what I could tell and from what I know, they were just making sure that everything was, properly cauterized and everything was properly dried out, so that there would not be any type of leakage in the casket. With her being autopsy too, everything was open up, so it was a more easy access to take care of those things. But as far as the face goes, there was some abrasions and there was some bruising marks to where they tried to de-swell. Now, I don't know how good of a job they did or things of that nature, or the family was pleased or not with their appearance. I don't know all of those details. But what I do know is the family saw her, and the family's request was, we're going to have a closed casket for the funeral. But yeah, there was some wax work that needed to be done. I do know that. I do know that they had to do heavy cosmetizing and things like that, because, even with the preparation process, they wanted to make sure that everything was totally covered up as properly as possible with that bruising. And when they did the spots that they did, they want to make sure that the whole face kind of blended in together as well.
Because she didn't die right away. She laid, as they said, an hour and a half to 2 hours. So Ryan, what's the difference if someone died right away and had that trauma to them to possibly 2 hours later? And
what do you mean 2 hours? Where was he at? Where was the husband? Was he not home?
He was drinking his wine out by the pool, according to him.
And she just
he passed out and laid out there from what his testimony is.
Correct.
What was the question?
So if somebody died right instantly and had that, as opposed to 2 hours laying and dying with this trauma, what your body response, what is happening there?
There's a lot of different responses. You got to remember too, it looks like she's bleeding. Okay. So you're going to have clotting issues. You're going to have distribution issues. Obviously there's a good amount of blood that gosh, I got to say it like this, that she expelled. How about that? That's a better way of putting it. That she expelled. You're going to be dealing with that. I think when someone sits, and for the folks that are listening that aren't in funeral service, just bear with us here. This is how we talk back and forth. But when someone sits for a consecutive amount of time, that blood coagulates. It gets thick. Distribution issues continue to occur because of that coagulation. That creates a lot of problems for our distribution when it comes to our arterial fluid, and when it comes really to anything. I honestly think that, I find it this with refrigeration. Obviously she wasn't refrigerated, but the longer someone sits in a refrigeration unit, I have more issues with fixation and sometimes distribution. It's the same way. The longer someone sits, whether it's 2 hours on scene, and there's a crime scene that's actually happening, the investigation's going on, pictures are being taken, no matter what, the time is our enemy when it comes down to it, until we can get, as Brian said, that embalming fluid or that arterial fluid into that person, that creates a little bit of leeway for us. But yeah, anytime someone's sitting, to me, it's never good. I'm not a fan. Brian, what are you smiling at?
Because you went straight into embalming. You're such an embalmer. Where my mind went with this question is, the injury occurred and she lived an hour and a half to 2 hours. What is the difference in her injuries?
Oh, that's where you were going with it, Kari? Oh, you took me way off.
So,
okay, so let's start over. That's a whole different conversation, dude.
No, I think that was good info. But Brian, yeah, you run with the other, because I think you know where I'm going with the question.
So Ryan, let me give you my bit, and then I'll have you correct me or add to. But
sorry, I went on a different tangent, Kari. I am so
rabbit
sorry.
hole.
Squirrel. So a alleged fall or alleged injury from, however, a blunt force trauma. A blunt force trauma happened. She lived an hour and a half to 2 hours after that blunt force trauma. So we have excessive bleeding. She didn't die right away. She's going to continue to bleed. Like Ryan did mention, a clotting factor, it could clot up in ways. We're going to have swelling of the tissues because she's still alive. Blood's still circulating. So we're going to have continued bruising. So if there were problems, injuries to the front of the face, chances are you're going to have swelling while she's alive and bruising while she's alive. If it would have been an instant death, your bruising is going to be very, very minimal. Experts can tell this just by looking at it. If that was an injury, right at death, or if there was some time in between. So those are pretty obvious there. Ryan, what would you add to that?
No, I think you're right on. I was way off, man. Sorry about that, Kari. I don't know what to say.
No, your info was so great too.
Now that, because Brian was laughing, so now I kind of feel stupid a little bit there. But no, Brian's right. I think there's a lot of discoloration that can happen within that time, a lot of swelling, and honestly, I think from a standpoint of tissue, that's one of our biggest concerns in that moment, because the longer someone sits, swells, changes color, the harder it is for us to reestablish that acceptable look. So that's what I would go with. I mean, Brian hit it on the head, but.
Yeah. So I think another part of this whole case to look at is our funeral director side, not as much the embalmer side. And I mean, John, since you were in this media frenzy, being in the area and stuff, there's a funeral going on during all this. So you have this murder suspect who I don't know if he was, I don't know the timeline because they don't really tell that, from when her funeral was to if he was actually under arrest. Do you know that?
Yeah, he was at the funeral and everything like that. And I know there was conflicts too, because, you have, it was a split family. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. So from what I understood, that he was there. So anyway, as a matter of fact, she's buried in Maplewood Cemetery right there, right in Durham. Done many services there. Know exactly where her grave's right at. It's right by a tree. And so anyway, they tried to keep it under wraps as much as possible, but you have the media all on the outside because the funeral home was right off the main drag there in downtown Durham. And so I don't know exactly every single detailed bit of the funeral and how things were done. The funeral home there actually is not in existence anymore. They did all the high profile people in that area at the time. But yeah, they did their best to keep it under wraps and to keep everything flowing and going as what the family would want. And from what I understand, they just tried to make it as simple as possible with all the media frenzy that was going on, because the funeral was delayed because, Ryan, I know you went down a rabbit hole there, but the truth of the matter is, she wasn't just at the medical examiner's office for just a day or two. She was there for quite a bit of while before she was brought into their care. So, Michael Pearson was under an investigation and all that. But from what I understood, he was there for the services and things like that.
Have you guys dealt with that scenario as a funeral director where you have to make funeral arrangements with someone who is under investigation, but they're not actually arrested at that point? So they are still in charge and I've only done it one time. Have you guys ever?
I've never done it. Now I've talked to, Brian and I have both talked to some that have, and it can be very awkward.
No, I haven't, Kari.
Yeah. John?
No, nothing. I mean, we've had somebody, that was incarcerated that came in, something like that, but no, nothing what you're describing.
Yeah, I just imagine, because that funeral director had to deal with Michael, who potentially was the one who did this, but it's hard to remain impartial and not jump to maybe conclusions, especially I would think in that scenario where the media is basically trying to tell you what you need to think and you can't really remove because it's everywhere. So I cannot even imagine that much information coming at you.
John, let me ask you a question. Was there any back and forth with him did he have the right of disposition or?
Yeah, he's next to kin,
So was there, well, he wasn't charged, right? So, it was one of those things where he still had the right. Was there any back and forth that occurred there? I'm sure there was some, well, at least within the community, probably some questions as to what was going on.
I don't know a lot of those details. I'm sure, all his and her children, had a lot to do with that as well. But a lot of that side on the funeral directing side and the logistics of all that, I don't have a lot of clue when it comes to all that type of stuff. I just know a lot more about, how she looked like when she came in and, kind of the gist and generalization of how things worked out as far as, the director sitting there across from the family. He didn't provide all that information and honestly, it just wasn't my place to try to pry into all that. But I wasn't privy to any of that.
No, you're right. I pry though. That's just what I do. What I will say is this: what a challenge that would be, though.
Oh yeah.
When it comes to just anybody, Kari. I've never dealt with a situation like that, but I know how that being that high profile, the news media, everybody involved. I would venture to say that was probably a big question. I don't know. I don't know the case. I don't know anything about it besides what I'm learning now.
We just hypothesize a lot with these, I think, because we don't know, and we're not talking directly to the funeral directors. At some point, I'm going to get a funeral director from a specific case that can give us a quote or something on these, because
it's tough.
Yeah. Well, and you can only share so much, I think, as the person in the situation too, because we give privacy to the people we care for in a lot of ways. And we're not going to turn around and then talk about this situation with the world, because that's private moment. So all we can do is hypothesize greatly. So I'm going to share the trial with you guys just a little bit. So they did, the kids were all behind Michael. They stood behind him until the court case started and the autopsy results came out and all these pictures. And then the kids kind of divided sides that they were like, oh, that's pretty compelling. Maybe he did it. And then all these other things started coming out, that he had been having secret sex with men and he had been hiring, escorts, and they found some stuff on his computer. And so they found that like him and her had been on the computer or something that night in the middle of the whole timeline. And so some of the theories were that she found some of his secret man ordering love information. I don't know what you want to phrase it.
It's kind of
and
hard
that they got into something over that. So that was some of it, but he was found guilty. But then 8 years later, there was a huge thing over the like blood tracing and stuff. And his case had to be relooked at, and he was released as innocent. And so he had been in for 8 years. Well, the blood guy was sketch and they put up for a new trial, and they basically told him, we can either have a new trial or you can take the Alfred plea. Tell me if I'm wrong on this, John. And basically he takes his Alfred plea and says, okay, I'm guilty. And he never has to go back to jail. He just time served and you're released, but you're always going to be a convicted murderer, whether he did it or not. And he decided, I don't want my family to go through this again. I'm just going to take this Alfred plea. I'm going to get out. It's going to be done and it's going to be in the past. So he is free now. He's a convicted murderer by label, and that's where it stands. So yeah, they kind of, everything moved on and they did this huge documentary. Now, the one big one I have to bring up is the owl theory. John, this is a crazy one. So a big theory is that an owl or a winged avian creature was to blame for all of this. That I don't remember if she goes outside or the owl got inside and attacked her. And because the damage is deep enough that the talons would cause that damage without damaging her brain. And I guess there was a feather and there was like a drop of blood outside. So they said she had wrangled with the bird or whatever. And then the bird had gone and flown outside and had dripped the blood out on the patio. And it had all been done by a owl. I mean, they've had like specialists like diving in on this crazy, but it makes sense. I don't know.
Well, I mean, talking about the rabbit hole, this is the owl hole, I guess.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, their theory is, if you look at the pictures, the one claw mark, quote unquote, looks like a talon from an owl. And, everything on the internet is true, right? So you can just Google owl, Kathleen Peterson, and there is dozens of websites and dozens of people that swear by this, that this is exactly what's happened. That's why there's no skull fractures. That's why there's no brain trauma that took place, because that was the main part of the trial for the defense for Michael Peterson is, if I really bashed her, how come there's nothing else? And you mentioned that earlier. So that's actually taken up more and more of speed of a theory here in the last recent years. Nothing like that was ever theorized while the trial was taking place. But that's become a big thing there. And I mean, people swear by it. I mean, you can go to those websites and they'll point out, look at those claw marks here. And they can actually have designs where they try to trace a claw mark on each laceration in the back and all that and all those type of theories. So, I mean, could it have happened? Yeah. Is it likely it happened? No. I mean, I lived out in the woods as a young kid growing up all my life, and we had our doors open all the time and things like that, even late at night. And I never in a well-lit house had an owl want to fly inside the house and want to sit down with us or have a glass of wine with us. So very highly unlikely, but that's a crazy theory. And yes, there are people out there who want to go down the owl hole for sure.
It doesn't sound like any allies that I've ever talked to.
Exactly.
They said if that went back to trial, they were going to bring up the owl theory.
I'm telling you. Yep.
But
I was interested in Dr. Is that Henry Lee? His examination of the blood, and he's a very well-known forensic pathologist. And when he started to explain some things, I thought that makes a lot of sense about, why it was where it was, where the consistency, and, he was able to recreate a lot of that. And I was like, okay, that seems logical. Sorry, owl.
So what was the actual cause of death?
That something say it was from blood loss, but the autopsy says blunt force trauma.
Yeah, that's what the coroner labeled it as. I say the coroner, the medical examiner, the head medical examiner there in Raleigh, Durham, and she even took the stand and tried to defend. Yeah, it was blood force trauma, and lacerations are either the skin going up against the object for a cut or a tear, or it's the object going up against the skin. And she was trying to make the case it wasn't her skin rubbing up against the staircase; it was an object that hit the skin. And so that was the big time arguments there.
Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, looking, because they had said it was like a fireplace poker.
Yeah.
Or blow, what do they call it? A blow?
It's a blow something. And they actually found it. I don't know if you saw that
at
at the end of the
garage.
documentary.
Yeah.
And but I don't think it was able to be in evidence or something. But how strange that was found, like in the basement or something. They couldn't find it at all. And then all of a sudden it was found at the basement. Well, ain't no doubt about it.
I was reading, some of the reports said that they found he had ordered 2 or 3 extras from a company. They don't know if it was like a somebody had called and ordered them and used his name, or if he had actually ordered them, because the one that was at the house was like an antique her sister had bought or something. And but they said that was the murder weapon. But you've got to wonder if you're hitting somebody's head with enough force to bust open the skin and stuff. But then they went into like, well, if you smash a watermelon, you're only hitting on one spot, but the whole thing will fracture. So you might not even have to have hit her 7 times, because if you hit something with enough force, you open up a different area as well. I don't know. When I was a kid, I dropped a broom on my toe, hit my toe, and the front of my toe split wide open. I mean, like blasted open. So, our bodies are not meant to sustain force in one area, because it's going to come out another area maybe. And,
absolutely.
Some of that just kind of comes into play. But
yeah, watermelon and the skull are 2 different consistencies.
No, really? No.
Sorry, I had to add that.
But it's interesting. I mean, all the theories, you can have one person talk all around this way and you're totally on belief, and then someone talk all around this way and you're like, oh, but that makes sense too. And then there's the owl. So it's
yeah, I don't mean to laugh at that. You're right though. That John, I agree with you. It's kind of a bogus, I don't know, a bogus attitude.
Got to reach for them straws, man. Got to reach for whatever you can do to try to prove your theories and prove your innocence.
Yeah. So the case itself, I mean, it's very simple. If you just look at some of the logistics, her trauma was not as extensive as some of the ones we've talked about, but I think because of all the facets in this story, and because it's kind of a big discussion right now, if you get on like a true crime, talking board, people, have you watched The Staircase? If you watched The Staircase, what do you think? Who do you think? Blah, blah, blah. And you kind of go down the rabbit hole of talking all these different possibilities when it comes to her. And then you have her sister lookalike that had died years ago falling down the stairs, and a lot of things to it. So thanks for bringing this case to us. I think it definitely was an interesting one and brings up a lot of good points. So
I really appreciate Ryan at the very beginning of this episode just emphasizing the blood and what you think when blood is on a person, because when you get a body in from the medical examiner, they don't wash them, they don't clean them. Mm-hmm. No doubt the blood was stuck and dried everywhere to her. And but when I was talking to the funeral director and knowing about the case, he said, yeah, I mean, when you just cleaned her up, it was fine. And soap and water is probably one of the best friends to an embalmer, mm-hmm. and best friends to the prep room. And if you can just get past all of that, and even delicately use Dawn, or what I like to use is Fast Orange to try to get a lot of that grit off and the dried blood off. It's just amazing what can happen and what can take place there. So, and I love it when Ryan says, stay in your lane, just stay in your lane, stay in your lane.
Hey, what I will say is I think this case, John, I appreciate you, buddy. I need that validation. It helps me day to day. It helps me. Yeah. What I will say though is there's still a lot of questions with this case, man.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely wild that guy did an 8-year term and then boom, he's done. and hey, I'll confess to it. I can never be true. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
A lot of underlying factors. And are you going to binge watch The Staircase tonight after we get off?
I'll go out in my garage, buddy. Turn Netflix on. Is it on Netflix?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'll hit it up then. I'll do it tonight because we did this case, guaranteed.
Yeah, it's interesting. But John, I think I want to add though, that is a question I get asked a lot. And I got it after the Watts family murder is, wouldn't the little girls have been washed off at the medical examiner's office? Or talking about other things, I get people say that, well, weren't they bathed as part of the investigation with the medical examiner? I think people don't realize they do an autopsy and send them on their way. So we will get people out and they're covered in blood. If it was a car accident, there'll be glass in their hair, glass in their, we've got clothing that's covered in windshield glass and dirt and asphalt and, all these things that were part of the death. And they all come to the funeral home and we have to kind of sift through. And the hair of especially a woman, the longer hair with the blood and dirt and everything is one of, I feel like, the biggest challenges to try.
It's all matted and everything else.
It's matted because it's been laying in a body bag.
Absolutely.
They cut through when they do the, the incision for the scalp retraction for the autopsy. So you've got cut hair, you've got dirt, you've got blood, you've got everything. And to try and clean it and make it look normal again, to me I just picture that with her because she had this beautiful hair that in every picture, just lovely, and thinking of just her hair being matted with that blood and for days. And it almost dyes the hair with that reddish hue.
Oh, yeah.
Even if you wash it, you've got to get like the right stuff to pull it out. And yeah, I just think
you're right about the dye. You're right about it dying.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy how it does that? But yeah, a lot of things to this. So thank you guys so much for joining again. And I think I'm so excited about our new thing that we're going to start pulling in some guest embalmers, because I think it definitely adds some value to this. So thanks for joining us, John. Thanks, Brian and Brian. Check out Ryan and Brian over at Undertaking the Podcast. And if you're down in North Carolina, go visit John.
I'll take you somewhere good to eat, I promise.
Yes, he posts the best pictures of food all over the countryside. I don't know how he finds it, but he does. My goodness. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.